This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 to 15. It's the basis for the sermon here at the First Free Methodist Church on February 9, 2025. It's part of our series called This is the Way, the Path of Following Jesus. So let's hear the text from the New American Standard Bible in its 2020 revision. Again, I'll be starting at the 6th verse of the 9th chapter of the book of 2 Corinthians. The apostle says this, "Now I say this, the one who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and the one who sows generously will also reap generously. Each one must do just as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace overflow to you, so that, always having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. As it is written, He scattered abroad, He gave to the poor, His righteousness endures forever. Now he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in everything for all liberality, which through us is producing thanksgiving to God. For the ministry of this service is not only fulfilling or supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing through many thanksgivings to God. Because of the proof given by this ministry, they will glorify God for your obedience to the confession of the gospel of Christ and for the liberality of your contribution to them and to all, while they also, by prayer on your behalf, yearn for you because of the surpassing grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for His indescribable gift." This is a well-known passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 9. It focuses on giving, and Paul uses an agrarian metaphor. And what that means, it's a farming story, a truth that every farmer knows, in verses 6 through 9, and really carrying through other parts of this passage. So Paul's letter to the Corinthians is written in preparation of his upcoming visit to them. He is traveling south through Greece and will eventually reach them. As Paul is traveling, he's collecting an offering from all of the different Christian communities in Greece for the church in Jerusalem, which is currently, at the time of this writing, under siege. So the offering that Paul has already received from the Macedonians up in the northern part of Greece has already been highlighted. And so he applies a metaphor that every farmer knows. If you sow sparingly, you will reap sparingly. Paul's kind of relying on the fact that farmers do not regard buying seed as a loss or a subtraction. He then continues to say, if you sow generously, you will reap generously. Farmers understand that seed is not a loss, but that buying seed is an investment, and that if they sow that seed generously, in other words, purchase enough seed so they can do so, they're also going to reap generously. Verse 7 in this text then makes clear that the choice is now before the Corinthians. And it's not just about literal seed, it's about how shall they sow spiritual seed, if you will. Now, Paul's language here in verse 6 and even leading into verse 7 makes it almost sound like there's a cause and effect relationship. Like if you don't give much, you're not going to get very much, but if you give a lot, you're going to be owed a lot or given a lot. I just encourage you to be careful that Paul's not really necessarily lifting up some kind of mathematical equation. And we're going to take note about how God gives in just a moment, and that will help us understand better what Paul means when he says what he does in this particular text. So the choice then is decided in the heart. In other words, the seed of the will. He says that you have to decide in your heart what you're going to do, not reluctantly. That's again back to the farmer thinking of seed as loss, not under compulsion because of some kind of guilt or force, because that would negate the gift. In other words, if a gift was given because you were compelled to do so, it's not really a gift anymore, and you lose the blessing that goes with that. Paul seems to argue that giving this gift is as much about motive as the gift itself. So what appears to matter is that one must choose rightly about how they're going to give. And what's the qualification there? Well, it tells us in this text that God loves a cheerful giver. Why? Well, God's grace overflows. We always have everything we need, an abundance for every good deed. That's the verse 9 part of what Paul's trying to explain here, is that God gives a grace that overflows so that we have everything we need, an abundance for every good deed. Paul wants us to envision, in a sense, God as a farmer, one who has given abundantly. But take note what it cost: the death of his one and only Son. And so what we need to hear is that this is not a mathematical equation that if you give a lot, you're going to get a lot, like many televangelists might say. But we do need to recognize that God is no less God for giving with a cheerful heart. The word to the Corinthians is the same. You will be no less forgiving. He then even quotes Psalm 119 to remind us in verse 9 that God is giving even to the poor. So all that's to say that there's something going on here about how we understand how the work of giving happens in our life, and it's a key passageway for us. Giving is a matter of a certain kind of investment. Paul reminds the Corinthians that their gifts are not a loss. It's an investment. And so giving for us is certainly financial, yes, but it's about every asset we have. Sometimes that's money, sometimes that's time, sometimes that's energy or effort. The truth is that we're called to share what we have in all the different frames of our life. Giving is an investment. It is in many ways a copy of God's investment in us. It's what Paul will call in the closing verse of today's passage, an indescribable gift. Paul's agrarian or farmer metaphor moves forward in verses 10 and 11. He takes it to the next level, and he moves from the sowing of seeds to what those seeds yield. Now, he highlights how the Macedonians, who are in the north, earlier in chapter 9 and even in chapter 8 he talks about this, the Macedonians who live in the very far north of Greece have already taken up an offering for the Judean Christians, those around Jerusalem. And he tells the Corinthians that Paul believes that the Corinthians don't want to be outdone by the Macedonians, especially since Paul bragged about the Corinthians to the Macedonians. So Paul again leans into this conventional metaphor of a farmer to help the Corinthians understand the basis of giving. He says that God supplies the seed. So the seed comes from God. We have to remember that. All things come from God. That's the first part of it. The second thing he says is then he gives seed to the sower and bread for food. Notice it's the beginning and the end of the life cycle of that seed. It started as seed, it turns into grain, it's harvested, it's turned into flour, and it makes bread for food. So it's kind of the beginning of the process and the end of it. Paul goes on to say that God supplies and multiplies the seed. There's an increase from the beginning. Every farmer would know this, that seed multiplies. And that's how he kind of goes on in this passage to say, then it increases the harvest of your righteousness. And this is kind of where he leans in and out of the metaphor a little bit. The harvest of what? Wheat or grain? No. The harvest of your righteousness. So that sowing a seed brings a harvest of righteousness, and it increases in that reaping of the seed that has been planted. And then he says that we're enriched in everything because of it, that there's a return on the giving, that God is the supreme giver. Notice at the beginning, God gives the seed, and the ending, God gives the bread for food. There's a return of the blessing, and it occurs sometimes in this material way, like the seed becoming bread, and other times it's in non-material ways, like the harvest of your righteousness. This cycle produces thanksgiving to God by the giver and by the recipient as well. Now, more on that in a moment, but that opens up another quick key passageway for us, that God's cycle of generosity is unending. God's cycle of generosity is unending. Paul makes it clear that God multiplies and increases the sowing, that's the resource needed, and the harvest, that's the fruit that's born at the end. It has been said that we cannot outgive God. The degree to which we apply this truth affects its fruit. Now, this isn't to say that $10 given equals $20 in return. Paul's simply offering a tried and true principle here, that if we embrace a life of generosity, it's a no-lose scenario. We're enriched by God at the front end, the giving, and we're enriched at the back end of the process, which is the reaping. And that cycle of generosity is unending as God works in the midst of it. Paul then speaks of the recipients of this gift in verse 12. Remember, Paul's offering he's collecting is for the Judean Christians as he describes how they'll be blessed in two ways. Now take note that Paul is applying the truth he just spoke of in the giving and in the receiving. He says that their giving will supply the needs of the saints. Well, that much is obvious. But secondly, he says it also is going to result in an overflowing in thanksgivings to God. Overflowing of thanksgiving. It's interesting that the cause is the giving, but the result is an overflowing in thanksgiving. The basic and essential understanding of giving as a blessing to others is simple enough. We get it. Paul says in verse 12 that this is a ministry, the ministry of this service. The ministry of this service. This is the essential work that we do for the benefit of others. But then Paul speaks of thanksgiving to God in verse 11 and here again in verse 12, that generosity prompts acts of thanksgiving and worship directed to God. You see, the first reactions or the response isn't to thank the giver. Notice how Paul does this. It's not about thanking the giver. It is to thank God. Generosity for the Christian, then, is grounded in the reality of moving other people toward acts of thanksgiving to God. Not thanksgiving to us, thanksgiving to God. What else? What else would move people to give of themselves as sacrificially as they do? And that's another key passageway for us. Generosity is a key marker of Christian practice. When we live in God's cycle of generosity, it causes a never-ending flow of giving and blessing. Paul wants us to know that the giving we do benefits others, ourselves, and God, that there's a synergy that happens in it. As compared with greed and hoarding, and its associated end game is ourselves. In other words, greed and hoarding is about us. Generosity is a key marker of dependence on God and the belief that we can't beat God at God's game of giving. Verses 13 and 14 open up even more the blessings that happen in giving. Paul is convinced that this cycle of generosity has benefits well beyond the giver and the recipient. He talks about in verse 13 how the Judean Christians will glorify God. They'll direct their praise to God. It's interesting that the receiving of this gift from the Gentile Christians is going to be a catalyst of praise to God. He talks about how their confession will be known among the Judean Christians. So he's telling the Corinthians that this is one of the ways that the Jewish Christians will hear of them, that their confession, the Corinthian confession, will be a blessing to the church in Jerusalem because the church that started in Judea has spread to Corinth. In other words, it's spread, so now it's coming back full circle again. And Paul says that they'll glorify God because what he says is the liberality of the gift. In other words, the largeness of the gift, its significant amount. And then he says they will also receive something from the church in Jerusalem. So here, remember, we talked about how giving $10 doesn't equal $20 in return. They give this gift to the church in Jerusalem, and it says that that church in Jerusalem will also receive that church in Corinth will receive something because of it. He tells the Corinthians that the Jews in Jerusalem who are believers in Jesus will be praying for them. That's how it comes full circle. Remember, there's been a lot of tension in Judea around Jerusalem among leading Christians. You can read about this in Acts 21, about the nature and inclusion of Gentiles in the church. In many cases, the Jewish and Gentile factions in the church are divided. This gift, Paul says, will endear them to each other, that they are praying and supporting each other through it. So Paul is going to be the relationship that connects them. And that's yet another key passageway for us, that sacrificial action brings hopeful reconciliation. Sacrificial action brings hopeful reconciliation. You know, the enmity between the Jews and the Greeks in the church was palpable. And Paul faces this in many occasions and in many places in his ministry. But he is attempting to bring those two factions together in this gift he is collecting. The notion of the Gentiles taking up an offering for Jews changes the balance and the energy in their conflict. You see, when divided, acts of generosity can help build new bridges of relationship which lead to healing. Generosity is a powerful act that creates relationships, connection, forgiveness, and reconciliation. We now turn to this very, very brief last verse, such an incredible verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 15. Paul says, "Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift." The word used here for indescribable is only used here in the entire New Testament. It literally means beyond words. And Paul is speaking of a reality about something very important, that God's gift in Jesus is beyond words, that this gift of Jesus bridges gaps and changes hearts in surprising ways. While generous giving between people is good, I don't want to diminish that. The dimension that God offers, though, changes everything. The sacrificial gift of Jesus brings life and hope to all, so much so that Paul can't even explain it with words. And that's our final key passageway, that we're never more like God than when we give. We are never more like God than when we give. Paul makes it clear that generosity is God's great gift made manifest in Jesus while we were yet sinners. When we step out of the cycle of greed and accumulation, we become more like God. This is such a powerful truth to learn, that giving is an act of love. And in it, we become more like Christ. We're moved forward in our sanctification by our willingness to stop the dead-end living of accumulation, because we are never more like God than when we give. If you have comments or reflections, I'd invite you to visit my website, revcraig.com. Click on News in the upper right-hand corner, and then on the drop-down menu, click Podcast. Click on this week's episode and leave a comment. I'd also encourage you to visit ffmc.org to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. I'd also encourage you to subscribe to our church's podcast, FFMC, First Free Methodist Church, on any of your podcast providers, and you'll be able to listen to this podcast passages there, as well as a podcast of every Sunday's sermon from First Free Methodist Church. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.